I'm going to do a continuation. We left off with the CIA document at the end of March that was based off of Sylvia Chase's probe into the FBI. And then Roseanne Ridgway's meeting with Oleg Sokolov and the DOS document that sparked the CIA document. Something I forgot to mention that I left out is that when I talk about these subjects that come up, I'm usually talking about when they initially come out into the press and into the mainstream. After that, they're usually sprinkled throughout and disseminated through newspapers throughout the country for months afterwards. So it's not that these just come up once and then they're gone. These things are actually continue and continue to be sprinkled through the newspapers and reach, middle America, small town, everything. So this stuff continues on after the fact, and I just wanted to point that out. But let's see, I don't want that up there. Let's look at this. Okay. So what we'll talk about now is that right around the anniversary of Samantha's death, so in 1986, around August 25th, I think this was August 28th, 1986, this article came out by a man named E.F. Danowitz. E.F. Danowitz, he was a former colonel and director of CAP for the Marines in Vietnam, and he taught Russian at a college called Rollins College. I think that was in Florida, Orlando, Florida. And I had seen some things written that maybe that college was connected to intelligence, but I couldn't really reaffirm that. So it could be, it might not be. But anyway, he taught Russian at Rollins College, had fought in Vietnam. So he was very tight with the military-industrial complex, for sure, and involved in the whole Soviet Union-United States conflict. So he writes this article after he took a trip to the Soviet Union, and he starts it off by saying, "Why did President Reagan kill Samantha Smith?" And this startling question was posed to me in a group of American visitors to the Soviet Union last month by a Soviet English teacher. So he was visiting the Soviet Union, and he goes on to talk about who Samantha was. But he says here, "There was no question in the mind of the Soviet teacher with whom I spoke, however, that Samantha's death was the result of a bomb placed on the plane at the order of the U.S. president. The teacher's question was why. He confirmed that his elementary school had been told so and was confident that the information was true." So before going on, I want to talk about, this is the first time I saw anything about somebody insinuating that there was a bomb placed on the plane and basically framing Ronald Reagan. I haven't gone into the investigation yet, and I'm not going to say that there was a bomb or there wasn't, but there were ear witnesses who heard more than one explosion. And they also said that the plane went up like napalm. I'm not insinuating anything with that. I'm just saying that in the investigation, in the NTSB report, this is said. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. But as we'll see, E.F. Danowitz wants to call this absolutely ludicrous. He continues, "To him, as well as to citizens throughout the Soviet Union, Smith was a symbol of peace. The sentiment that the Soviets held for this young American was opposite to that accorded Reagan. The communist press continually has depicted his objectives as militaristic and inconsistent with the warm desire for peace held by all Soviet people in their own government." So he's saying this like it's something that it's absurd for Soviets to say this, but we all know Reagan, and we remember his presidency. And of course, obviously, there would be people who don't live in the United States that would view Reagan that way, and they have every right to. So him saying that, yeah, he's basically he'll say that the Soviet Union used propaganda and disinformation, but his article here could absolutely be construed as propaganda. He's just doing it from the other side. It's not that one side doesn't and the other side doesn't. They both do, and we all know that. So I pursued the question of disinformation on the death of Samantha in Kazan, the final stop on the Volga cruise. I brought up the subject while speaking with a small group of Soviet in-tourist guides. When I asked the guides how Samantha had died, I received only the angry response, "You know how she died." The implied answer was evident. Efforts on my part to clear the name of the President of the United States from complicity were hopeless. The Soviets would not listen to the truth. Soviet officials had done their job well. Everyone believed Samantha Smith had died because her objectives for peace were in conflict with the objectives of her national leader. Soviet mentality would not accept tolerance of such disagreement. That it did not exist or existed only in the minds of perverted officials really did not matter. So he's saying that it's absurd that they're saying these things, but he himself is not backing anything up. He's just saying, well, how can they say this? Because in his mind, he's elevating Reagan like he's, Gandhi or something. It's obviously a propaganda piece, but this came out right around Samantha, the anniversary of her crash, keeping in line with the connections and the patterns that we're developing with these things coming out around certain events, like I was saying before with the summits, and this one with Samantha's anniversary of her crash. And like I said previously, this was disseminated in the papers and then sprinkled throughout America over the next month or two. This article was used. So the next thing that came up was the NTSB final report. And that came out at the end of September of 1986. And what I want to highlight with this really is just their final conclusion. Right here, they give an abstract of what happened, but this here is the gist of their final conclusion. This is what they state. The National Transportation Safety Board determines that the probable cause of the accident was the captain's continuation of an unstabilized approach, which resulted in a descent below glide slope. Contributing to the unstabilized approach was the radar controller's issuance and the captain's acceptance of a non-standard air traffic control radar vector, resulting in an excessive intercept with the localizer. So really that right there is what they came up with. That's their final conclusion. In other words, it was pilot error and maybe some issue with the air traffic controller. That's what they came up with. So there's nothing about the weather here. There's nothing about that there was something wrong with the plane. There was nothing about the pilot being inexperienced. All these things that you see in the Wikipedia article that I had brought up before. And yeah, Wikipedia, you don't really want to use that as your sole source, but that is what most people go to, and that's what they're going to see. And so that being in that Wikipedia article is absolutely misinformation at the least. And you see right here that they say nothing about the weather, nothing about the plane, nothing about the pilot's inexperience. It was basically his fault. He flew an awful flight, and there might have been some issue with the air traffic controller giving him an unauthorized maneuver. And I'll get into all that when we go into the plane crash, but I'm not going to talk about all that right here. But I just wanted to bring this up, that this came up in the end of September, and that is their conclusion. It was basically circumstantial, and the lead investigator for the NTSB, James Burnett, actually comes out and says that it was completely circumstantial and they have no idea what happened. And this is all they could come up with. So the Wikipedia article obviously doesn't say that, but that is the truth. And so after this, I came across something in the Reagan archives, and it's this document here that comes from the Reagan Library, the Reagan archives, and they talk about, did Samantha die in an accident, or was she murdered for humanizing Russia and thereby undermining Reagan's production of Russia, the evil empire? So this stuff is still out there. They're still talking about that this was probably, that there was foul play involved. So right after the NTSB came out with their final report, they came up with this document, and they go through and they talk about the NTSB's final final conclusion. Commuter airline safety questioned. Pilot is faulted in main air crash. So they bring this stuff up, and it's almost like saying, okay, well, there you go. Reagan wasn't involved. Look, this is what happened. And so Reagan's off the hook. Thank God, right? Because of the NTSB investigation. But when we go through the NTSB investigation, we will see that it wasn't as simple as they're stating, and there was way more to this. But they felt some relief, I think, because of that NTSB final conclusion. And it's documented in Reagan's library here, but this is something that I had found. So moving on, after I found this document in the Reagan library, I came across an article that was written by a man named J Mac Maclellan. And this was in early 1987 in Flying Magazine. J Mac Maclellan was a writer for that magazine. He was a excellent pilot. And just to talk about quickly, as a quick aside, I actually contacted Mr. McClellan, and he graciously responded, and he's one of the few who did, as I've tried to contact a number of people, and most, they either don't respond to me or they politely decline. I actually even requested an interview with Jane, Samantha's mom, and she politely declined, which is understandable. But McClellan, he actually responded to me, and I'll go into that when we talk about the plane crash, but I wanted to bring up his article here that came out in early 1997, and it came out around the time that Jane was actually going through a lawsuit with Bar Harbor Airlines. But I just want to talk about this quickly. A couple of things that he talks about in here. This is a great article, by the way. This quote here: despite comprehensive study, the NTSB could not determine what went wrong, and that right there sums it up. Right there, they didn't know what happened, and they basically concluded circumstantially that it was pilot error. Which what really is pilot error? Why was there pilot error? That comes up, and an unauthorized maneuver given by the air traffic controller, Richard Benton, he's one who never responded to any of my calls when I tried to talk to him. But this is interesting. But the last paragraph of his article, he says, so all we know is that this crew flew one of the worst ILS approaches ever documented, but we don't have a single hint as to why. The NTSB recovered radar recordings of this crew's last several ILS approaches, and all were normal. Without cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders, there's no way to know what the crew members said in the cockpit or exactly how the airplane behaved. We can only guess what happened on that dark night. And this article is great, and there's a lot of things that I want to talk about in this article, but I just wanted to bring this up, that this came out as well. And he says that this is one of the worst flights ever recorded in history. And it came out right around the time of Jane's lawsuit as well. And she was in the papers as they asked her about this article, actually. And she said that she wasn't allowed to comment on it during her lawsuit. Shortly following McClellan's article, or story in the Flying Magazine, was an article by a man named David Wood, and this came shortly after, I think it was July of 1987. And let me bring it up. Oh, there it is. And it's called Propaganda Flourishes in the U.S.S.R. by David Wood. David Wood was a journalist since 1970, I think. He was a staff correspondent for Time Magazine, the Los Angeles Times, News House, News Service, the Baltimore Sun, which the Baltimore Sun was the one that had reported on Samantha's plane crash really early, right after her plane crash. If you remember that the CIA wound up creating a document based on that article from the Baltimore Sun. But David Wood was a birthright Quaker and conscientious objector and pacifist, and covered guerrilla wars in Africa as Time Magazine's Nairobi bureau chief from 1977 to 1980. And he was also a Washington-based correspondent since 1980. And he reported on national security issues at the White House, Pentagon, State Department, and covered conflicts in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Central America. He also reported on the Cold War from Russia. So this guy is definitely highly connected to the military-industrial complex as well. And differing from E.F. Danowitz, though, Wood seems to be more left-leaning, you would say, from his description. So keeping with the narrative at the time that it was a right versus left thing, and communist versus anti-communist, David Wood would be considered on the left and anti-communist or communist, pro-communist, not anti-communist. So you would think that maybe he would bring a different viewpoint to this, but that would not be the case at all. And we'll see here with this article. He brings up that CIA document that came out the previous year that had Samantha in it. And he says, in sharp contrast to the more liberal, reasonable, and westernized image presented to Americans by Soviet officials and journalists, recent Soviet news stories for domestic and third world consumption assert that. And what he was referring to there was Mikhail Gorbachev and his period of glasnost, where they were going to be more open and honest, allegedly. And so now he's using that and siding with Mikhail Gorbachev that he's good, but it's just the KGB now and their propaganda machine in the Soviet Union. So instead of really probing and looking into this and thinking that, if Samantha's plane crash did come down and it was brought down on purpose, that you would think it would be somebody from the right-leaning anti-communist, thinking that Samantha was propping up communist Soviet Union, and you would take that opportunity, I would think, to actually look into this more deeply, and maybe there is something there, but David Wood does not do that. And he brings up the things that were in the CIA document. Here's Samantha Smith. And these are some of the other things that were in there that I didn't talk about before, but U.S. officials kidnapping babies in Central America, military scientists creating AIDS. There's the assassinations, Indira Gandhi, Olaf Palme. There's a couple others. And then they talk about Jonestown as well in here. Such stories seek to promote a decades-old Soviet view of the United States as a bloodthirsty, imperialistic exploiter. Implausible as they seem, such reports. And there's your tactic of what they are accusing the Soviet Union of doing. They do in these articles as well. Implausible as they seem, right? He's trying to sway the reader to his opinion without saying how some of these accusations are not true. He doesn't go in and say, well, he just cites them and just says that they're crazy, right? And he's not backing up what he's saying either. So this article, he talks about, goes into more detail with this stuff. He talks about the U.S.IA and that, and here he talks, glasnost is real, but nobody's told the KGB, Romerston says. So he's now taking the viewpoint that, okay, well, Mikhail Gorbachev's all right, and it's just the KGB and the old U.S.S.R. and this and that. But most people on the left and the peace groups were very much on the left, were still for the Soviet Union at that point. And so he's basically, he has the opportunity to look into this deeper, but he's just basically reiterating the same points that have been perpetuated from all of this. So he's not doing anything different except trying to get it out of people's minds that Samantha's plane crash was suspicious. And so moving on from him, we come across an article right around the second anniversary of Samantha's crash. And this one basically says the same thing that David Wood's article said. It's by a guy named Brian Brumley. And Brian Brumley was an AP journalist and Associated Press bureau chief in Moscow. At one point in 1991, he accused the KGB of shadowing him in the early 1980s due to their belief that he worked for the CIA. So maybe he did work for the CIA. We don't know. But here's another journalist being used by the military-industrial complex, intelligence, continuing to perpetuate that Samantha's plane crash is rubbish if you think it was brought down on purpose. And he goes into that in this article. And he starts it off by saying the Soviet media may be singing a different tune on internal matters, but they are still playing harsh melodies about America, including what U.S. calls disinformation. And he says the intent is to tarnish the U.S. image abroad, according to Soviet defectors. And he then goes through and lists the same things with the AIDS, CIA, with Jonestown, the assassinations of Indira Gandhi and Olof Palme and all of that. And he just reiterates kind of what David Wood was talking about. Brings up the USIA again and Romerston and talking about, the various forms of propaganda and disinformation and all of that. So this was right around the second anniversary of Samantha's plane crash. So this is still all very much in the mainstream news as all of these articles continue to get disseminated down to even the small town newspapers. So they're still very, very concerned with the accusations that are forming from the Soviet Union. And it's obviously it's elevating Samantha, and you wonder why they are so concerned with these accusations. To put it into these other, group it in with AIDS, Jonestown, killing babies, whatever they're throwing it in with. To me, it just seems like they're trying too hard here. And as I was going through all of this, I was really starting to see that, Samantha was far more important than it was ever led to be believed. So, this continues with that, and we're going to see that coming up soon, these articles are going to stop, and that brings me to my next article that I have here, a letter to Samantha, and this came out by a guy named Robert Webb, and he worked for the Cincinnati Enquirer, but he was a Washington D.C. correspondent, so he was another one who worked for Washington, was involved with the news that was coming out of the Central Intelligence Agency and the military-industrial complex. He worked there in Washington, D.C., but appeared to be a correspondent, a writer for Cincinnati Enquirer. And his stories also just continued to get disseminated as well. But this first article that I'm bringing up, a letter to Samantha, Robert Webb wrote this back when Samantha initially wrote her letter. And he talks about that she was being used and by the Soviet Union, and he continues with that narrative, and he really props it up here. So back then, where his allegiances lie. He's obviously with the government and military-industrial complex and all of that. He talks about, let's see, for all the hubbub over the Hitler diaries, the bigger hoax may be Yuri Andropov's letter to Samantha Smith. Not that the Soviet chief didn't write or at least approve the touching epistle to Samantha. And that's an interesting point right there. He's actually bringing up and insinuating that Yuri Andropov may not have even written that letter. And that's something that I've always actually thought myself, that I don't even think that Yuri Andropov was doing all of this with Samantha like the mainstream media wanted it to be perceived. In my mind, I actually have the thought that Mikhail Gorbachev probably wrote that letter back to Samantha or had something to do with it. And I'm not the only one that actually has even thought that. There was a man who I'll bring up later on down the road, a man named Edgar Heiskell. And Heiskell was a really good friend of Arthur Smith. He was the best man in Jane and Arthur's wedding, and he was he was, I think he was in it was West Virginia. I think he was. He wasn't the governor. I'll have to go back and check on that. But he was the Secretary of State or something for West Virginia. But anyway, he actually wound up being Jane's lawyer through her lawsuit as well. And so through all of this. And he is quoted as saying that he believed that Mikhail Gorbachev actually wrote the letter and not Yuri Andropov. He actually said that himself as well. And he also says that Samantha was way more important than people were led to believe. So two things that I absolutely agree with him on. And he was Arthur's probably closest to being his best friend. But anyway, he brings that up in this article. But he talks about that and talks about how Samantha's being used by the Soviet Union. But the next one I want to bring up, and this one came from, let's see, we'll bring it up here quick. This is Soviet disinformation stuff. Here we go. The Soviet campaign of hatred is what the article is called. And in here, he talks about Glasnost. Glasnost and summits aside, the Soviets are purveying the nonsense that Americans are spreading AIDS, butchering Latin American babies, yada, 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 all of that. And in here, he also talks about Samantha over here when he's talking about Jonestown massacre in Guyana, supplying chemical and biological weapons, toy bombs to Afghan rebels, assassinating Samantha Smith. So they're throwing her plane crash in here and talking about it being possibly assassination, but throwing it in with these much larger conspiracy theories, I guess you would call them. And it really, once again, elevating Samantha, and why are they including her in all of these things? It's a legitimate question to think that, like I said before, that the right were calling Samantha a useful idiot. You know, Yuri Bezmenov and Mona Charen talking about this, but she's being thrown right in there with all of these other accusations. And so Robert Webb continues basically what all of this is doing. And really this was right around the Geneva summit when he was talking about this stuff. And like I said, after Robert Webb's article here, the Geneva summit happened, I could not find anything popping up anywhere after this. All of the accusations had died down. And the Geneva summit, or was it? Yeah, no, the Moscow summit, sorry, in 1988. And then Reagan was out of office, obviously. And then you had George Bush come in, and the whole scare of the Cold War and the Soviet Union and all of that really died at that point. And terrorism took over at that point. Yeah. So this, it was definitely a coordinated effort to throw Samantha in with all of this stuff and basically squash any idea that her plane crash was suspicious. So, and really, I would actually argue that Samantha's visit to the Soviet Union was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. I think that's a fair point to make. And I think that she was being used. Soviet Union, or was it something else like I talked about before with the United Nations? We'll get into all of that down the road. But I think it's fair to say that Samantha's visit to the Soviet Union marked the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. And I think that was by design. I think that was on purpose. I think she was more important than people believe. I think she was used for that. And so I've gone through the years from August 25th, 1985 up into the Moscow summit here in 1988. And all of the accusations that came out in the mainstream, the CIA documents, the FBI file on her, all of this stuff, at the very least, showed to me that, okay, yeah, she was definitely involved in some larger scale operations going on this planet, political and religious, all of that. she was very important. So talking about my first question when I came into this, do I want to pursue looking into this? Was there somebody on the plane that warranted somebody wanting to take it down? And I think I've shown through all of this that Samantha was absolutely important. And that comes back with a resounding yes. And it's not going to end here. I'm going to do another video after this about the Samantha Smith story, which followed the same exact trajectory of all of this. And it was supposed to be produced by Robert Wagner. So the next video, I'm going to talk about that. That'll be a good one. And then after that, I'm going to talk about her influence on Russia and Soviet Union. And I think that's a point that really needs to be made. And it's probably one of the most important points to be made, was the influence that she had over the Soviet Union. And she still holds that influence today, as children that were in the Soviet Union then are now grown up, and they all remember Samantha Smith and what she did for their countries. So that's going to be a good one too. So I'm going to talk about that as well. And then I'll wrap up this portion of talking about where did all of the accusations come from? Were they legit? Who was saying them? Was the military-industrial complex following Samantha? They were going to make a TV movie about her. She had incredible influence and charisma over the Soviet Union. All of this stuff, without a doubt, is going to show that, yeah, she was a very important person. And there absolutely are people who would have some motive to want to take her out. So that'll be it for this episode. In the next one, I'm going to talk about Robert Wagner and the Samantha Smith movie. And that'll be a good one. And I'll see you in the next one. I'll see you then. All right. Thanks.